Okay, now that we've got the Object First appliance securely in the rack, connected and powered, the next step in the setup process is to access the text user interface to begin the initial configuration and give the appliance a permanent location on the network so that you can access it and begin sending data to it. So let's get started with the text user interface setup. Okay, the first thing that you're going to be greeted with after you've turned on your Object First appliance is the license agreement. You can access this by leveraging your remote monitoring solution, such as iDRAC as an example. And here you're going to tab over and accept the terms and conditions. The first question it's going to ask you is this a net new Object First cluster, or perhaps this is an additional node that you've purchased? And if so, you can choose to add this to an existing cluster. But for purposes of this example, we're going to create a new cluster because this is our very first Object First node. Okay, the first screen you're going to come to is setting up your network interfaces. It's going to ask you for an IP address, your subnet mask, default gateway, and primary and secondary DNS server. So in this case, I'm going to run through and enter that information now. Once you've entered those settings for the network interface card number 1, hit enter. It's going to advance you to interface card number 2, which will do the exact same thing using an additional available IP address. Everything else will remain the same as interface card number 1. So I'll go ahead and enter in the new IP for NIC2. And once you do that, you should be able to simply hit enter here. And then it's going to ask you for a host name. In this case, our host name is going to be obj1st-demo-02 for this particular example. We'll simply hit enter. It'll go through and update the network information of your appliance. The next step you're going to come to is your NTP settings. So we do have some default NTP servers. You can leave those as is or enter your own if you like. And we do have network time security we can turn on for an additional layer of security. We'll put a check in that box and hit enter. It's then going to go out and do its initial time synchronization. The next screen you come to, it's going to ask you for your cluster name. And in this case, we're going to do obj1st-lab. And it also is going to ask you for a cluster IP. Now take note, up until this point, we've needed 2 available IP addresses, one for each network interface card. This is going to be a 3rd additional available IP address that you will need to earmark for this appliance. This is going to be the IP address that Veeam will connect to the appliance through. So in this case, we're going to do 172.16.4, and our cluster IP is going to be .70 in this case. Remember that. Next, it's going to ask you to assign an administrator password to the Object First appliance. Take note that there are password complexity requirements here, so you may need to spend a little bit of time creating a very secure password before you can advance to the next step. So I'll go ahead and enter our password here. Once you've entered a successful password, it's then going to configure your cluster, and you are done in the text user interface. Now, as you can see here, it shows you your S3 endpoint IP address, which is that .70 that we referred to earlier. That's going to be the IP address that we leverage next to jump us over to the web UI to start creating our buckets and users. Last step that's very important is telemetry service. This is enabled by default, and we highly recommend that you leave this turned on. This will proactively alert Object First support should you have any disk failures or any hardware failures of any kind. And if you leverage our consumption licensing model, this is a requirement. So keep in mind that that must remain enabled if you're leveraging the consumption licensing model. So we'll simply hit next here. And now we have completed the initial configuration in the text user interface. There are certainly more things you can do here in the TUI, such as you can remove or replace a disk if you were to have a failure. You can enable, disable telemetry services if you decided to enable it later, let's say. But for purposes of this quick tutorial, we're done in the text user interface, and our next step will be leveraging the web UI. Okay, this concludes the setup with the text user interface. The next step in this process is to leverage the web UI which we're going to take that service point IP that we created at the cluster level. We're going to access it via a web browser so that we can then start setting up our S3 keys and buckets. Join us on the next video to see exactly what that looks like.